M&A's most critical challenges. I'm Richard Martin, Chief Business Officer of Mergerware, and I will be your moderator today. The highly competitive global environment has made M&A an increasingly common occurrence for businesses both large and small. It offers the promise of achieving significant growth and competitive advantage in the market, yet the goals of most mergers are often not achieved. With the understandable focus on the financial potential of a deal, people issues are often unaddressed, unseen, and at times unappreciated. Organizations that fail to seek advice on M&A issues are often guilty of trying to reinvent the wheel, while getting the right help from experienced teams and individuals saves valuable time and resources. It's pretty obvious that HR plays an important role in the M&A process, helping determine the quality, capability, fit, and valuation of its new and existing talent. After all, the talent is a large component of the deal. By fully considering the so-called soft aspects of the deal, organizations can gain an invaluable employee buy-in for the new company's strategic vision, which in turn raises the odds of a deal being successful. Integration teams must look to HR to help individuals through the process, supporting the overall business objectives of the deal, and making sure the day-to-day activity to deliver a product or service is maintained. In today's webinar, we address many of these challenges, and we are very fortunate to have with us Zoe Bogan, a highly experienced and knowledgeable M&A integration professional from KPMG, with experience in project management, integration planning, issue resolution, cultural assessment, finance and budgeting, stakeholder management, and relationship building. As you will soon see, Zoe has a great deal to share. But before I hand it over, a few administrative issues. Today, please use the chat feature for any questions that you have. We will address Q&A at the end. Throughout the presentation, there'll be a number of polling questions, and please use the chat feature again to respond to those. And we will distribute the recording and the deck after the webinar. So I'm just going to kick off with some data to sort of set the stage for the presentation. And Zoe, I was struck by this statistic that 77% of the reasons for employees leaving could have been prevented by the employer. And if you look at this, you're seeing that voluntary turnover is predicted to hit 35% by the year 2023. Competition for workers has intensified over the last several years, as we've seen. Even with a stronger economy, job creation is expanding at a record pace, and unemployment has declined to historic lows. So this creates a very significant challenge for U.S. companies. It hinders their ability to grow and take advantage of this economy. Now, a couple points to consider. Since 2010, job openings have increased by 138% to more than 7 million people. And this data comes from Work Institute, their 2019 Workforce Retention Report. At the same time that openings have increased, unemployment has declined by 57% over the same period to under 4%. So as U.S. companies grow and add jobs, unemployment continues to hover under 4%. The only solution is to poach workers from other companies. And there are simply not enough unemployed workers to fill the gap. So as we see, this turns into real money. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median wage for a 40-hour worker is about $45,000 a year. Using a conservative estimate of $15,000 per employee, the total turnover cost for U.S. companies is around $6 billion a year. That is a great deal of money. And if you think about my initial statement that 77% of the reasons employees quit could have been prevented, and using that number, the voluntary turnover rate is about $475 billion. And by that measure, if you just have a 10% improvement in reduction in turnover, that's a $47 billion savings. 20%, $95 billion. So the point is that these are very, very real numbers. And I want to get your perspective on this, Zoe. But before I do, let me just quickly ask the audience, at what stage do you typically involve HR teams in the M&A process? Please use the chat feature to register your answer. We'll wait half a minute or so. Okay, so Zoe, let's come to you now. Given that backdrop, what are your initial thoughts?
I think you raised something very interesting, is that people matter. And I think more companies are aware of this, but they're really starting to put things into action to address some of these things. And so part of the process through integration, and typically why you have some failures or challenges, is for a few things. For starters, I think companies in the past have not brought integration teams in prior to closing. So integration typically has not been involved in due diligence, but that is changing. I have seen HR teams be involved in due diligence, which is great. The importance of bringing integration in during due diligence is because you really need to sit and process and identify and understand what the issues are so you can course correct this in the integration plan. That's really important, and it's really telling. And although maybe there's not necessarily that many actions to do during due diligence, the listening part, the assessing part is really important for the deal. Another aspect in terms of challenges for integration is really aligning of the vision of what that looks like. Typically, many times the target has an idea of what this merger will look like, and then the acquiring company will have an idea in terms of what that looks like. Everyone really needs to kind of be on the same page. And although during the early stages of the deal process, it may seem that they are, when you get down to integration and things really start to merge, you see that maybe we were not as aligned as we thought we were. Another key item, and I'm excited to get into this a little bit later, is conflicting organizational and cultures. And what does that mean? You cannot negate the importance of culture. And I will tell you this, culture is more than people. Culture is IT systems. Culture is selling. Culture is everything. Culture is procurement. Culture is clients. As an example, so if you look at cultural difference, say you have a small target firm, right? And their typical process for onboarding a client is about maybe a day, maybe two. They don't have that many steps in it. Now you're talking about bringing them onto your system, and the onboarding process is 2 weeks. Well, that really significantly affects the client experience. That is a cultural difference, and that needs to be course corrected. So in an instance like that, you determine, wow, well, is there a way to have our process streamlined, make it a little bit shorter, or how are we kind of dealing with the clients or engaging with the clients to kind of make up for this long period? So culture is in everything, and I'm excited to really get into that a little bit later. The other aspect of a key challenge is assuming that the acquiring firm knows best. Not all the time. Maybe from the target company you are pursuing, you can kind of learn something. It's not necessarily that your way is the best way. So that could really be considered. Resourcing and budgets, integration budgets are really important. So let's talk about what that looks like. When you're doing an acquisition, you really kind of need to have the right team in place. That's from the work streams and even from the business. Business leads needs to be identified, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But when you have the appropriate resources in place and they're ready to go and understand how to action some of the things that they're dealing with, that is great. Typically, some organizations have training, they have center of excellence, and they have tools. So anybody coming on board from a work stream perspective can understand what is expected for them, the steps that are outlined and are needed to complete a successful integration, and how they need to kind of engage with others. That's really important. And also with the integration budget. So typically based on deal, integration budgets vary, right? But what is important is the story that it tells. So for example, if you're doing a cross-border deal and you may pad in visa costs, right? Because you don't know what that looks like. That's telling a story. So at the end, you determine, did I need to use the cost for visas or did I not? What other things kind of came up that I wasn't aware of? What's the kind of welcome event communication strategy? What was the onboarding cost? That's really interesting. When you stand back and look and say, you know what, how much did it cost to onboard an employee? So the integration budget is really telling, and I think there is a story in numbers, and people should not negate that. Another item we should also think about is poor planning and execution. You have to plan appropriately and you have to execute. So I'll go back to my first comment. Integration needs to be involved in due diligence, listening, planning. So when it comes to the time of close, they are ready to go. The work streams involve understanding how they are transitioning from due diligence to integration, and they understand what the long view looks like. And what I mean by the long view, they understand what's happening in day one. They understand what's happening in 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. And typically with integration, they are assessing companies for about 2 years. And that's a good time period to really get all the kinks out and understand, did you maximize the value drivers that you were seeking to do? So that's really helpful. Another item that's very, very important is getting clarity on the risk and creating action plans. So as an example, Richard, you mentioned turnover of employees. That's not necessarily always a bad thing. Typically with mergers, you expect some turnover, but you don't want it to be drastic. And the other aspect of it is you want to make sure it's something that you are controlling. So for instance, if an employee does not feel welcome due to lack of communication, that's something you can control. However, if aspects of the jobs are changing and you are ready to, or feel that maybe all employees don't align with the new vision, that's okay too, but you really want to be clear on what that looks. And there need to be clear action plans to address these risks. All work streams going from HR to IT to procurement, the client onboarding need to be clear. Okay, I have this risk right here. Here is what good looks like in terms of dealing with it. And do not be afraid to address and communicate the risk. It is all a journey that we all need to be a part of. And attention to people and change. Again, we're going to get into that a little bit more in terms of how we should kind of deal with the employees, the type of communication that's needed. And lastly, before we move on, it is very important to identify a business integration lead. While you have typical corp dev integration teams, that is great, but you need to have also a business lead there during the acquisition for the day-to-day after close, guiding the employees, dealing with the business issues, understanding how market development has changed, providing services. I'm just really engaging. That is really important. And that actual business integration lead should be identified during due diligence. Although, again, their work may not start typically during that period. They need to be identified, they need to be on board, and they need to be ready to go. And my last point before we move on, training. Training is important. I think it's really important for corp dev teams to have a training module for the businesses and work streams, just to kind of make sure that their skills are sharpened. And for those who have never done it, to show them what it looks like. And it's equally important to kind of discuss how the trends are changing and how their behaviors need to be modified. How it looked 10 years ago and 5 years ago is not how it looks now. And we need to be made aware of that and be ready for action when we have our acquisition.
Excellent. I mean, you've raised a lot of really important points, which we're going to get into shortly. As we go forward, I just want to, I think that one of the things you mentioned earlier. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you are good to go.
Okay, so sorry, I apologize for that. I was saying that I really enjoyed your point about culture being more than simply people, and then being IT and selling in other areas that are critically important. And so I hope that people take a chance to give their perspective on this issue for the polling question. Let's move on. Zoe, I think go with your last point, which was identifying the integration lead and sort of organizing the team and change management. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails?
Sure, sure. So typically, you have a partner sponsor, and the partner sponsor may not necessarily always be the business lead, but they'll be involved in outlining them and putting them together. But when I'm talking about setting up the team, I'm talking about making sure that you have the appropriate work streams in place and leads for those work streams. So that goes from HR to IT to F&A, and just really make sure that they're on board and understand what it looks like. Typically, you have kickoff meetings to kind of educate these individuals, and you also have templates that they will use kind of like along the journey just to make sure that they're updating you and the team and understanding the interdependencies. Now, when you get to the business, that's broken down a little bit more as well. So I highlighted that a business integration need is needed, right? Very important. The other aspect of it is that you may need is a business HR partner to kind of walk along with HR to say, you know what, who should receive a retention bonus? How are we really engaging these employees here? That's very important. This person may not necessarily be the business integration lead, but they're part of the business teaming with the HR. Another aspect is having the business understanding maybe that a client onboarding business resource is needed to understand, okay, you know what, with this new merger, now our services are different. Well, typically, a corp dev or, a client onboarding professional can answer that, but the business can. The business can say, you know what, this is how this merger is going to shape our client experience, shape the services that we're offering, and this is kind of how we need to forge forward. That resource also needs to be identified. So in addition to the workstream, the business needs to be very clear in terms of what this merger means from a resourcing perspective, from professionals in their departments and how they need to support the merger. That's really, really important. Sure. And I can get into a little bit more about change management, but happy to go further.
Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and also, what are the specific skills? Because I recognize that often these aren't people's day job,
right.
And so, what are the skills that need to be looked for to identify those people? Can you give some advice?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one thing I will say is project management is extremely important. Really, really important, great project management skills. But you know what? Let's get into specifics about HR really quick. So when you're dealing with an HR professional, project management is important, but they also need to have a firm understanding in terms of compensation and the compensation packages and the differences, right? So experience in compensation is extremely important in that aspect because they really need to be able to understand and identify the difference in compensation packages between the target and the acquiring company and how to merge two effectively. The other aspect of it is from an F&A perspective. So typically they are responsible for revising or assessing revenue, determining how this new product or service or merger is going to affect the numbers. So in that aspect, having a clear understanding of F&A, which is something that they do in their day job. But project management skills and understanding the interdependencies is really, really, really important. From a change management perspective, this is really interesting, and I'll kind of tell you how this evolved a little bit. So typically change management in the past may have sat in HR, but they're starting to see that change management actually falls outside of HR because change management doesn't typically only deal with people. It deals with IT, it deals with selling, and it deals with client onboarding. And so for that aspect, we do have an in-house change management team that we work with. And what's really interesting that they did was, we were going through one acquisition, they created a very interesting heat map. And the heat map highlighted, it was from red to yellow to green. And it said from a change perspective, where we were for each of the work streams. And again, I highlighted, this is more than people, right? So for IT, it may be red. Why would it be maybe red? Because we use a Dell and they may use a Mac, right? So that's servicing the client differently. And so what we saw through the journey of the onboarding of the acquisition process is that each area may not necessarily be green at the end, and that's okay. Remember when I started, I said, get clarity in terms of the risk and what it looks like. It's not saying that if you have a yellow in an area that is bad and it has to go to a green. Or if you have a red, but you want to be clear that you don't kind of want to have too many change differences. And if you do, you need a mechanism in place to address it. So I'll give you an example, bringing it back to HR. So say you have a small acquiring company, right? They're small people, maybe about 25 people, 30 people, but then you have a large company, right, which has 10,000 employees. Typically in that scenario, there are specific year-end and interim assessment processes that you go through, which are great. But from a small company, that can be cumbersome. In that instance, right, it's not necessarily saying that they'll be totally green coming over to our HR processes, but a yellow is okay. So we'll leave them alone in other aspects and make sure that they're brought onto our compensation plan in other aspects. So that's an aspect where you can kind of allow a target company to kind of be a standalone, but not too far, and allow them to function how they like. But typically, what I say is for workstream skills, project management is really important. Being an expert in your field. Although this may be new territory for them, we are challenging them to be subject matter experts in their area, bring the right advice and to guide us. So those are kind of two things, and be able to work across functional teams and identify the interdependencies.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that there's a lot there. You know, what I found interesting was your point that compensation, you know, F&A are areas that you know, these professionals have to have some understanding of, which, you know, kind of leads me to my next question. Excuse me, about costs, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the role in calculating the cost of the integration, and, you know, where they're responsible for policies and practices? Because obviously, as you noted, this goes beyond just the people. So in other areas, what's the role?
Sure, absolutely. Great question. So typically what we do is we team with our IT. Well, we team with all the work streams. And what we want to do is get a clear understanding in terms of what the integration budget looks like. And I'll give you an example. So for our real estate practice, our ION team, what we do is there's a cost. There's a cost if you are onboarding a number of partners and building a new office. That cost may be, I'm making up a figure, $20,000, $30,000. That goes into the integration budget because that is a cost for bringing these individuals on. In terms of real estate, keeping them in the same building? Are we getting a new building? Are we extending the lease? You want to be clear about what that figure looks like. That's an integration cost. Another aspect from IT. Well, how many computers do we need to get? And in terms of connection, is there a cost of kind of connecting data? You need to be really clear about what that cost looks like. Now, from an HR perspective, we highlighted the importance of understanding what is the cost for onboarding an employee, doing background checks? That needs to go into the integration budget. And one aspect, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit later as well, is the welcome event, the onboarding. What are we doing to kind of make people feel welcome? That really needs to be onboarding. And people really spend a lot of time and effort into the welcome event for employees because it simply says to them, you matter. And at the start of this, you really want to be clear about the narrative of saying, you matter, here is how you fit into this new design that we are trying to create. Here is your role in the journey, and here is what the next step looks like. And so that's cost, right? And so you really want to outline that in your integration budget, under HR, under welcome events. But each work stream typically has costs associated with it, and the integration core dev teams with each of the work streams to understand what those costs are and understand that they may change. So example, I said before, if you have a cross-border deal, maybe kind of there are visa items that you want to plan for. It doesn't mean typically that they will be used, but you want to be aware. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about Black Swan and what that looks like, but you want to reduce the surprises. You want to be able to anticipate, enhance, and move people right along and give them certainty. Like in instances with deals, you may encounter some things that you have not seen before or you're unfamiliar with, and that's okay. As long as you are a subject matter expert in your area, we kind of outline tools in terms of how we're going to address it. You can with it. We've seen that before as well.
That's great. Yeah, and to your point about cross-border deals, I think this really leads to our next polling question while the audience takes a moment to answer. Yeah, I think that's really important. You know, cross-border, I think, adds several additional challenges, in particular communication around language. We'll go into more detail around this shortly, but I think that that's something to, all your points are really important, and I think even that much more important when you have some inherent challenges like language barriers or style of communication, discussion, and negotiation, etc. So we'll give the audience just a moment to add their data. Okay, and we'll go into our next question, Zoe. So, speaking of communication, whether it's cross-border or just US or wherever, it's obviously important. So can you talk a little bit about what integration teams can do and HR can do to help those lines of communication stay open, help employees know what's going on, and avoid, the dreaded, bunker mentality of we don't know what's happening, so I'll just go into paralysis mode?
Absolutely, great question. So throughout the integration process, communication is so important. It is one of the key factors. And as we set up our deals, we have communication in two areas. We have a client communication work stream, and we also have an employee communication work stream. And I'll tell you the difference between both. So under HR, we have a communication team that streamlines the frequently asked questions for leadership and also employees. And what they are really doing is working in hand, not only with HR, but the culture team to say, you know what are some of the cultural impacts that you identified? Let me make sure that I'm weaving this into the communication strategy to help them understand that they matter. And also, after kind of close, what is our typical communication strategy? So for instance, there may be one messaging after close and another message to them 5 days later or 30 days later to kind of take them through the journey in terms of, well, how are you onboarding here? Are you having any IT issues here? Did you know that you can go to this person? So what we do with our communication work stream, specifically with HR, is prepare frequently asked questions, not only kind of for leadership, but we kind of prepare frequently asked questions for the employees and put them in a newsletter and make sure that they are answered. Another aspect that we recently, not recently, but we put into play are effective transitional coaches. So these are individuals that are already in the organization, and we pair them with these incoming employees just to make sure that they are guiding them in the appropriate way, informing them of the resources that are here for them, and just listening to them. That is really important, to be able to listen to them. And so how we kind of advance this program as well is we provided talking points for the transitional coaches in terms of things that they may hear. Here is how you address it. And we had follow-up calls with them just to kind of say, what are you hearing from the target employees? Are they happy? What things are they dealing with? So we can then again put that into the frequently asked questions. So listen, communication is key, because that is the area that you say you matter, and you really want to be clear in terms of how you are communicating you matter, because that goes into the turnover that you talked about. So very, very important. And then another aspect of you have client communication. So how are we communicating to the client? Is our messaging clear? Because again, with this, you do not want to lose clients. The key is to kind of continue to grow business. Don't want to lose business, but communication is key in all areas. And once you have your communication right, things definitely flow a little bit better. But you need to be clear about what that looks like and make sure that you have the subject matter experts in place to address those communication needs.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess I'm somewhat inspired by the Sherm commercials that talk about the importance of people. So your point about you matter is really important. And to that end, maybe you can talk about a little bit how we help individuals through the process, right? Which is obviously critically important, but at the same time, you have to support the overall business objectives, right? Because there's the activity of delivering day to day, the product, services, et cetera. So maybe talk a little bit about how you balance giving employees the help they need, but at the same time, really focusing on achieving the goals of the merger and achieving the new business objectives.
Sure, great question. So one thing that I highlighted previously is that we implemented our effective transitional coaches. So each employees, again, have one-on-one transitional coaches to really help answer a lot of their questions. Some things that can be cumbersome to them is maybe client onboarding and putting a client through the system. You now have a coach or individual that can help you. Another thing that we started to do is give customized lunch and learns, right? And so these are areas where a number of employees may have come up and say, you know what, I'm really having an issue with client onboarding. Okay, you know what, we are going to have a special course. Everybody get together in a conference room or do a webinar, but we kind of like the in-person touch and say, here is the client onboarding process. Here is what it means for you. Here is how you action this. And so a few lessons learned to kind of deal with the day-to-day is really important, especially when you see a number of employees having the same question or the same issue. You want to make sure to address it. Another item is, again, I mentioned how important that business integration lead is, very important, and corp dev. Corp dev typically will have an integration team just sit there amongst the employees just to see what you're hearing, see what kind of can be addressed, see what kind of can be actioned. This allows the employees and the business overall, right, to make sure that the day-to-day business activities are continuing, but the concerns of the employees are not lost. So it's really important. So you talked about day-to-day activity. If you address client onboarding, and client onboarding is really important because you need revenue to kind of run a business, right? You address that effectively as a day-to-day mechanism or issue, you have no issue. You deal with people, you deal with the business, and again, you still kind of have a nice communication strategy to the employees to say, you know what, here is what the new merger looks like. Here is what you can kind of expect in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months. Here is some training that is important to you. So in addition to kind of from required training, maybe kind of get an understanding, if the merger allows for it, to understand what are the skills that are needed to kind of help them develop. Because you want them to, we always talk about workforce of the future, right? So a merger really kind of deals with workforce of the future. And you want to make sure that they are incorporated in that new workforce of the future and what that looks like. So again, I'll say, if you have a number of employees that are having the same issue that the transitional coaches are seeing, have a lesson or lunch and learn to address that. Really, really, really important. Have HR there, just sitting and hearing. Have corp dev integration team there, really just sitting and hearing. And just be comfortable with, and be flexible with moving things, the communication, how we train them, just to kind of fit their needs.
That's great. Thank you for that. So, I'm going to turn now to our last question for the audience and for you as well. So, is that about the top mistakes during a merger and acquisition? And so, I've identified a few of them in terms of being, and audience, please log your answers via the chat window for this poll. We'll share this data at the end. I've logged a few in terms of being involved early, understanding employees' needs and concerns, et cetera. And I'm interested to see what the audience perspective is. But I also, want to ask you, Zoe, what are the top mistakes? So other than these, maybe you can expand a little bit about, what are the areas that people need to really pay attention to? What are typical mistakes, and how do they avoid them?
Well, we kind of highlighted initially at the start some integration failures, but one aspect that I think all companies can evolve on is really understanding the cultural fit and really respecting the importance of culture and really how it makes or can kind of hinder a deal. And I'll give you an example. Many times they say, when you're acquiring a target company, don't. You're going to acquire them, but don't mess with their culture. Their culture is their secret sauce, and you need to be clear about what that looks like. I'll give you an example. So, as an example, say you have one target company, and they usually have an afternoon break where people kind of get together and have a contest in terms of judging a gingerbread contest, right, during the holidays. That may seem simple, right? It may seem simple, but would you know what's going on there? Camaraderie. And you cannot deal with or try typically to kind of mess with the camaraderie that is going on in an organization. You really need to pay attention to things like that. I'll give you another example in terms of cultural difference. So say you have one company, right? And they say their typical salespeople close deals in about a month. Another company, their typical salespeople close deals in about 3 months. That's the life cycle. Now, when you look a little bit deeper in terms of the differences, you notice that the salespeople that close companies in about a month, they're commission based only. The individuals that have a longer closing period, they have a base, typical base, and then their commission is about 20%. Well, the incentive to close a deal is different, but that is a key cultural difference. So you kind of aligning the two and say, you know what? You are either going to be full commission or you're now going to be base commission would not necessarily totally work, because you don't necessarily want to move all the individuals who are closing deals in 1 month to now closing deals in 3 months, right? Because that specifically or really affects the business growth and the revenue. But you want to be clear about what that looks like. So one thing that I can say that M&A is evolving to is really highlighting and understanding the importance of culture and what it means for the deal, understand how to course correct, and really pay attention to the black swan. So after the close of every deal, you close it, and maybe 1 month or 2 months after, it's like, wow, that was it. The black swan is something that you did not see coming, but that was so valuable. You want to pay attention to what that black swan looks like. So in terms of involving HR early, I see most organizations doing that. That is great. But the culture piece is something that we can really work to advance and be clear about what the risks are and the action plans that need to be included to really deal with any risks that we're identifying, and make sure that we are getting the value drivers that we seek from the deal.
Thanks. I mean, you gave a really good example of cultural differences. For example, the afternoon meeting issue and the camaraderie building. For you is that how do you assess that, right? So that's a great example. How can M&A teams assess and manage those kind of cultural differences? And in your opinion, since you have you see a lot of activity, how many organizations are actually doing it?
Well, I think more organizations are doing it now than they were before, which is really good, right? So you have to start somewhere, and more organizations are highlighting the importance of it. You're starting to see more cultural conferences. You're starting to see more cultural webinars. So many organizations understand that it's not necessarily something that is fluffy or high pie in the sky, but something that we really need to address, which is really great. Now, in terms of addressing cultural differences, here are some things that I have seen. So even before close, what our change management team typically did, which was really interesting, is you have a culture workshop. You have a culture workshop, and that includes a target company, it includes acquiring company, and you include some of the key work streams, and you just have a discussion. And it's light, and you're kind of creating a vision about, well, here, what do you do over here that's different than what we do here? Here are our process in terms of like outlining, again, I'll go back to client onboarding. How do you feel about that? And even in that culture workshop, which is really interesting, that's where you identify, okay, you know what? We typically have a HR interim and year-end process where you have to complete forms and submit goals, but you know what? Maybe you don't have to. And so really being clear, even before close, about what that looks like, what the cultural differences looks like, and having an open and honest conversation with all leadership and some key employees that can be brought in is very telling. It's very important. And it says to the target company that, you know what, again, that phrase of "you matter" means something, and that phrase of "wow, I'm really in part of this journey." And just because the acquiring company doesn't always know best, you kind of need to sit back and realize what you don't know, and maybe how we can kind of advance or evolve through this process. So early cultural assessment workshops are really helpful throughout the process. Following close, a really great strategy also is Surveys are really important. Focus group with leadership is really important. But again, I'll be very clear. Leadership, middle management, and staff sometimes have different perspectives of what the company looks like. So, utilizing leadership perspective for your cultural assessment is not always the best thing. You really need to have all points of view when you're getting a full view of culture. Because again, I'm going back to client onboarding. If you're doing client onboarding, typically leadership is not going through the day-to-day process of going through the steps in terms of background checks and filling out engagement letters, but the middle management, they are. Staff is doing it, so you want to get their perspective in terms of what that looks like. So culture, again, is really important. And another great thing that I have seen done, culture work streams really make sure that you are expanding to more than just HR, realizing the cultural impacts of F&A, of procurement, of IT, and be able to speak about what that looks like, and even of selling. Selling is really important. If two organizations have different cultural strategies in terms of how they sell, that will definitely impact the business. And you need to make sure that you are communicating that effectively, determine okay, what does the new culture look like in terms of what we are trying to create? That is really, really, really important. So happy to see how culture is advancing. Culture definitely has a ways to go in terms of how it advances, but I'm happy to see that there is focus on it now. And companies in the end will benefit definitely from all the work we're doing with culture.
Thanks. That's a great point. As we come into the closing of the webinar, I have a final thought I'm going to share, and maybe you can have a comment on, because this really very much echoes a point you made in your introduction about preparedness. This quote comes from a gentleman, Ewan Relly from BDA Partners, who I met last year, who made the point that he can't stress the importance of preparation. I won't read the whole quote, but time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted. I think that really is a very important thing, is preparation. And having a process that you can repeat and utilize on a go-forward basis is really important. So I have a question I want to put to you for the Q&A. So one question, I'm going to summarize this, is basically, what about if you actually want to make a cultural change? What advice do you have, and how do you proceed in the cases where maybe, not a great example perhaps, but maybe you can't have those afternoon meetings in the example you gave? So how do you create a cultural change without disrupting the organization?
So in terms of it could be an afternoon meeting, it could be a webinar. So for instance, if you don't necessarily want to kind of take people, and I'll say in quotes, offline, to kind of go in a conference room for about an hour and a half or 2 hours, you can do a webinar. And what you can do, so if you do a webinar and it's shorter, then you have them more frequently, right? You have it maybe for like 45 minutes, just to make sure that the employees are getting the nuggets that you want them to get, and they're able to go back and do their day-to-day job. So if you can't kind of do it longer, do it in short bits, just to make sure that they are understanding how they kind of need to modify their behavior with the new cultural model, or the new model and shift. The other thing about culture, I will say, it is important to get buy-in. So if you have buy-in from leadership about what those afternoon meetings mean, then the cultural shift is easier. But if you don't, it's harder. So that's why I said having that culture workshop up front is really important, because it keeps the dialogue going. So after close, everybody is clear about what the steps are, and there are no surprises. But getting buy-in early about how everybody is approaching culture together is important. And remember, I said within that culture work streams, it's not just the business leads talking to the partner. No. We have work streams in there. HR is in there. The culture team is in there. IT is in there, because everybody needs to be on the same page in terms of what that looks like. So if IT needs to have a lunch and learn about the new system, and here is how they kind of get into this system, that's important. That is important, because it keeps the day-to-day going. It keeps the employees engaged. And I'm telling you, there is something about that human connection Webinars are great, but the human connection is really important, especially as more people are working remotely, which is a great thing. Flexibility is awesome, but we cannot negate the human connection. And throughout everything, again, you always want to say you matter. So think about how you are communicating. You matter to employees.
Sure, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. One other question for you is, how do you, and maybe it's just, how do you address specifically language issues? Do you have any specific advice for language issues during a merger? Not just, I guess, the language, but I'm assuming also the connotation behind it as well.
Right. I would say be patient. Be patient. Be patient. Another aspect of it is if you are dealing with countries, right, where the accents are extremely huge, and and when you get on calls, it's sometimes hard to hear people. Maybe you implement something where people have to write their comments. That makes things much clearer. That makes things much clearer for a number of individuals, and you kind of like get everything out there. So I would say be patient. I would say be respectful of different cultures, especially as you do kind of cross-border deals. How you do it, especially how we do it in the US, is not necessarily how individuals do it in other countries. Sometimes we may have a more advanced system and we want to kind of be patient with other countries, especially as we bring them along the journey. So that, again, writing things down is extremely helpful. It just makes things much clearer. And when you're on a call and can't always articulate accents, it just helps things to make things very, very plain. So
that's great advice. I think writing these down, that's a great advice as well. All right, so we've come to the end of our webinar. And I want to invite people to learn more about Mergerware, and obviously if you want to contact Zoe, her information is here. We will distribute the webinar replay and the deck after this. And Zoe, I just want to thank you very much for sharing your information. I think you provided some, in a short period of time, a very, very strong and detailed information about how integration teams can do, better jobs and such. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise.
Oh, absolutely. I had a great time, and thank you for inviting me. And I will leave you with one quote because you highlighted preparation. So here is one phrase that all people can take away with them. So proper preparation prevents poor performance. Prepare, prepare, prepare.
Excellent. I think those are definitely words that everyone should take to heart. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us today. And I look forward to our next conversation and next webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks.